All right, let's dive into two really important regional treaties that are absolutely central to understanding environmental democracy: the Aarhus Convention and the Escazú Agreement. We're going to explore how one single legal principle grew into two very different treaties, each one shaped by the unique legal world of its region. Now, if you're studying international environmental law, getting a grip on this comparison is essential. It really shows you how law evolves and adapts in the real world.
So, here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start at the very beginning with their common origin in Principle 10. Then we're going to dig into the different legal environments that shaped them, and this is really the main argument of our source material. After that, we'll do a direct pillar-by-pillar comparison, look at the brand new ideas that Escazú brought to the table, and wrap it all up by unpacking the critical difference between procedural and substantive rights.
You really can't understand Aarhus and Escazú without first understanding their shared DNA. Both of these treaties are, at their core, direct implementations of Principle 10 from the 1992 Rio Declaration. And this single principle, it's the very foundation of what we now call environmental democracy.
This principle lays out a simple yet incredibly powerful idea. It establishes three interconnected public rights, which you'll often hear called the three pillars of environmental democracy. So what are they? First, you've got the right of access to environmental information. Second, the right to actually participate in environmental decision-making. And third, the right of access to justice, which is what makes sure the first two rights are actually enforceable. These three pillars provide the entire structure for both treaties.
Okay, so here are our two main players. On one side, we have the Aarhus Convention, adopted way back in 1998 for Europe and Central Asia. And on the other, the Escazú Agreement, adopted 2 full decades later in 2018 for Latin America and the Caribbean. Now, that 20-year gap and those vastly different regions, those are not just trivial details. They are the absolute keys to understanding every single difference between these two treaties. And that brings us right to the main argument of this analysis: the deep differences in style, in focus, and in legal character between Aarhus and Escazú that can be traced directly back to the very different legal worlds they grew out of. In international law, context isn't just some background detail. It's the architect that designs the treaty itself. Here it is, the core contrast. The Aarhus Convention was born in Europe, a place that already had this dense, highly structured, very technical framework of EU environmental laws, or directives. It was a build-up based on legislation and procedure. In complete contrast, the Escazú Agreement came out of Latin America and the Caribbean. This region isn't defined by a supranational legislative body, one that sits above the states like the EU. Instead, it's defined by a powerful and dynamic inter-American human rights system, with a really influential court that drives the law forward. To really get the Aarhus context, just look at this timeline. Long before the Aarhus negotiations even started, the EU had already laid the groundwork for the three pillars. The 1985 directive established public participation, the 1990 directive established access to information, and the 1996 directive made sure the public could comment on industrial permits. So Aarhus didn't have to invent all these procedures from scratch. It was essentially taking a pre-existing directive-driven framework and harmonizing it. So, what wasn't a major influence on Aarhus is also really important to understand. Today, the European Court of Human Rights has a lot of cases dealing with the environment, but that just wasn't the situation back in the mid-90s. The whole idea of environmental human rights in Europe was still in its early stages. So, because of that, the original text of the Aarhus Convention wasn't really shaped by a human rights conversation. It was shaped by the technical, procedural language of EU environmental law. Now let's contrast that with the world Escazú was born into. This quote comes from a huge 2017 advisory opinion by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. An advisory opinion is basically an influential interpretation of the law by a court. And get this, it was delivered while Escazú was being finalized. The court declared that the right to a healthy environment was its own standalone right. This was an incredibly powerful, rights-based statement from the region's top human rights court, and it fundamentally shaped the DNA of the Escazú Agreement. Now, that big advisory opinion didn't just come out of nowhere. The court had been building this legal foundation for years. For instance, in Claude Reyes versus Chile, the court said that the right to freedom of expression automatically includes the right to get information from the government. Then in Quechua People of Sariacu versus Ecuador, it established that the right to property means the government has a duty to consult indigenous peoples about projects on their lands. And finally, in Saramacca People versus Suriname, the court found that if you deny a community a legal identity, you're preventing it from getting justice to protect its property.
These cases were creative interpretations that built a foundation of access rights, which were then explicitly written right into the Escazú Agreement.
Okay, so with that crucial context established, Aarhus born from procedural EU laws and Escazú carved out of dynamic human rights court decisions, we can now jump into a direct pillar-by-pillar comparison. And you're going to see exactly how these different origins show up in the actual text of each treaty.
Let's kick things off with the first pillar, the public's right to get their hands on environmental information held by the government. This is the bedrock, right? You can't have meaningful participation if you don't know what's going on. So how do the two treaties handle it?
Okay, let's walk through the details here. First, look at the row for basis for refusal. The Aarhus Convention gives a very specific, harmonized list of reasons why a government can refuse to share information. This creates a lot of legal certainty across all the member countries. Escazú, on the other hand, lets countries base their refusals on their own domestic laws. Now, the source material points out that this could weaken the right if a country's laws have really broad exceptions. But now look at the next row, information from private entities. This is where Escazú takes a huge step forward. Aarhus doesn't say anything about information held by private companies. Escazú explicitly requires states to promote public access to it. That's a big deal.
All right, let's move on to the second pillar, the public's right to take part in environmental decision-making. I mean, it's not enough to just be informed. People have to have a say in the process.
You can really see where they came from here. First, let's look at the structure. Aarhus reflects its procedural background with 3 separate technical articles for different types of decisions. One for projects, one for plans, and one for regulations. This totally mirrors the way the old EU directives were set up. Escazú, though, uses a single, comprehensive article that just lays out these broad overarching principles for participation. Now for the really big difference, look at special considerations. Aarhus just talks generally about the public concerned. But Escazú, directly reflecting that human rights case law we talked about, is way more specific. It calls out indigenous peoples and creates a clear duty for the state to actively remove barriers for persons or groups in vulnerable situations. That is a direct injection of human rights into a procedural framework.
And now for the third and final pillar, the one that gives the other two teeth, access to justice. This pillar is what guarantees that the public can actually go to a court or some other independent body to challenge decisions and make sure their rights to information and participation are respected. Again, the differences are just so clear. Let's start with standing. That's basically the legal right to bring a case to court. Aarhus defines specific tests. A person or group has to prove they have a sufficient interest. Escazú, however, mandates broad active legal standing, which makes the system much more open and accessible. The scope of review is also wider in Escazú. It lets people challenge almost any action or omission related to the environment. Aarhus ties its review process more tightly to the specific types of decisions mentioned in its other articles. And finally, look at support. While Aarhus simply suggests removing financial barriers, Escazú mandates the creation of support mechanisms, even mentioning things like free legal help for vulnerable groups. This really drives home its strong focus on equity. So that direct comparison shows a clear evolution, right? But the Escazú Agreement didn't just tweak the Aarhus model. It introduced several totally groundbreaking provisions that just don't exist in the older treaty. This marks a true generational leap forward in environmental law.
So, what are these new ideas? What truly sets Escazú apart and makes people see it as a model for the future of environmental agreements? Let's break down the 3 most important ones.
First, it officially brings in the concept of vulnerability. It recognizes that not everyone starts on a level playing field and puts a direct obligation on countries to provide support. Second, and this is so important, it includes a specific article, Article 9, that requires states to protect environmental human rights defenders. This was a direct response to the tragic reality that Latin America is an incredibly dangerous place for environmental activists. There's nothing like that in Aarhus. And third, as we're about to see, it takes the huge step of including a substantive right. And this leads us to what is maybe the most profound legal and philosophical difference between these two treaties. The distinction between procedural rights, which are all about the process, and substantive rights, which are about a fundamental outcome.
Let's make sure we're crystal clear on this. The 3 pillars we've been talking about, access to information, participation, and justice, those are all procedural rights. They're the tools, they're the means to an end. They make sure the process is fair. A substantive right, on the other hand, is the end itself. It's the fundamental entitlement to a result. In this case, the right to actually live in a healthy environment.
And this slide puts the difference in black and white, straight from the treaties themselves. Look really closely at the wording.
Aarhus, in its main objective, says that in order to contribute to the right to a healthy environment, countries shall guarantee the rights of access. The legal obligation is on the procedure. Now look at Escazú. It's so direct. It says each country shall guarantee the right of every person to live in a healthy environment. The obligation is on the substantive outcome itself. This is the big shift from an obligation-oriented treaty to a truly rights-based one.
But here's the really smart, nuanced conclusion from our source material. It warns us not to just say one is better and one is worse. It argues that even though the language is different, the obligation-focused style of Aarhus, which was so heavily influenced by those detailed EU directives, doesn't necessarily make the rights it provides any less valuable or effective in the real world. The two treaties just use different legal philosophies to get to a similar place, a philosophy shaped by their unique contexts.
So let's bring all these threads together. This comparison isn't just some abstract academic exercise. It's a powerful lesson in how international law actually grows, evolves, and adapts to its surroundings.
So the key things to take away are these. Both treaties bring Principle 10 to life, but Aarhus is a product of Europe's structured legislative tradition, which makes it a really strong procedural tool. Escazú, on the other hand, is a product of Latin America's dynamic, court-driven human rights tradition, and that led it to introduce these new protections for defenders and vulnerable groups, and to include that powerful substantive right to a healthy environment. That's the difference between an obligation-oriented approach and a rights-based one.
And that leaves us with one last, really important question for the future. As we face environmental crises that are more and more global and urgent, what does this evolution tell us? Is this shift from a purely procedural framework like Aarhus to a more holistic, human rights-focused model like Escazú, one that explicitly protects defenders and guarantees an outcome? Is that the necessary next step for creating international law that's not only fair in its process, but actually effective in its results? That is the challenge these two treaties pose to the world.